Hi folks, welcome back to the channel and thank you very much for joining me. Once again, you are most welcome. Today I want to talk about a subject that has always fascinated me because I, like a lot of people I suppose of a certain age, I saw this playing out on television in the nightly news in 1982, the Falklands War. Now the Falklands War is one of those sort of crazy wars that starts, misunderstandings, ambitious politicians, power, mad leaders and generals and all this kind of thing. So we had a situation where there's been a territorial claim on the Falklands for the best part of 200 years. The Argentinians have this claim against the British. It all goes back in the midst of time. But the fact remains that the majority, I think 98% of the island, wants to remain under British control. They did then, they still do today. But there was a referendum 5 years ago, I think it was, and the same was true then. However, in the early 80s, the Argentines had a military junta taking over control of their country. Not a democracy at this point. And it was led by a chap called General Leopoldo Galtieri, a real sort of tub-thumping, highly decorated, I'm not sure whether it's by himself or not, I don't know the background, but let's say dubiously decorated general. And he became the leader of Argentina. And immediately, after about, I think 18 months he's been in power maybe, a lot of problems in Argentina of course, still some of these problems today, but certainly at that time there was a real problem with political dissidents. There was a lot of unrest in the country, there was a lot of shortages, the economy just absolutely crashed completely. The currency was just worth almost nothing, having a really tough time, the people there. So this guy who's taken over with his military decides that he'll deflect attention, if you will, from what was going on and seizes on this idea that they're going to maybe retake the Falklands, which will stop the dissatisfaction, the rioting and the problems at home, make him very popular if he can secure these islands, and kick the British out. Okay, so without getting into the history of Argentina, there's a bit of a cross-contamination, if you will, or alliance is probably a better word than that, where the British were heavily involved in the development of Argentina at the start of the 20th century. There's a lot of British involvement, and maybe, part of the British Empire, perhaps it hung on in there a bit too long, and there was a lot of disquiet, and eventually they got kicked out by Perón and, Eva Perón and Juan Perón. Anyway, we won't go to the history of Argentina because I'm not an expert on that. I'm sure we've got 1 or 2 Argentine subscribers, so I've got to choose my words carefully and make sure I don't say anything that's wrong. I'll let them tell us the history. But anyway, back to the Falklands. So the islands, or the Las Malvinas, as the Argentines call them, it's a very strange sort of topography, geography of the island. It's basically a number of islands, but effectively two big islands with Falkland Sound down the middle. They are 8,000 miles away from the UK, so very hard to police and control. The weather, climate, is much more like, well actually I suppose this is one advantage the Brits did have actually, because the weather is very like Wales or Scotland, very similar looking terrain, very similar weather, especially in the winter. So it can be, it's down in the South Atlantic, not far from the coast of Chile, and of course Britain had an ally in Chile who were not, they've been at sort of almost simmering war, or like a Cold War with Argentina for some time, so there's not good relations between those two countries either. Anyway, cut a long story short, at the beginning of April 1982, first of all, the Argentinians landed on South Georgia and took the island. South Georgia, of course, is the island where Shackleton is famous for his discoveries and Arctic expedition launching from there. That's over 100 years ago now. So they took South Georgia first, and then before you know it, they in a few days they then they came ashore at Port Stanley, and there was a tiny British garrison. I think it was only literally, I think it was it 25, 30 or so troops that we had, Royal Marines. Overwhelmed just by sheer numbers, weren't expecting an attack, they were only a token force, and there was a bit of a shooting match. I don't think there were any fatalities, and then basically the Royal Marines surrendered because they knew that they were going to endanger not only themselves but the civilians in Port Stanley. So they surrendered to the Argentine force. Wasn't a very big force. I think it was about 2,000-3,000 troops max. And then they came ashore with some amphibious craft, and they brought their aircraft in, the Pucara ground attack aircraft, and Hercules and all this kind of thing, transport planes. And they secured the airport, Port Stanley, and without much of a fight, because there just weren't many British troops to put up a fight, they took over the islands. Now, back home in the UK at the time, Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, first woman Prime Minister in the world, I think, but certainly in Britain, she was actually rather unpopular. She was a right-wing politician, been elected really, there's been a number of years where Britain had swung between right-wing, left-wing governments with Labour and Conservative. She'd taken over in 1979 in May, and promised lots of reforms and trade union reforms, and we had a lot of, a bit like Argentina, we had a lot of problems industrially. The UK was in a bit of a mess and was considered to be the sick man of Europe when productivity was poor, output was poor, morale was poor. We weren't doing well financially in the international markets, and a lot of problems in our economy. She was going to sort all this out, and she started doing that, and she started having sort of conflict with the unions and all sorts of other issues, which made her very unpopular, actually. She became very unpopular quite quickly, within about 12 or 18 months. So this issue is occurring basically 3 years into her premiership, mid-term if you like. Not doing well in the polls, really struggling. And she was absolutely incensed. Now, you could argue that the British were sort of a little bit asleep, Joe Biden fashion. And we weren't really paying enough attention because of all these other domestic problems. So, it quickly became apparent that a foreign power had invaded British soil with violence, And this, if you know anything about the British, you'll know that this is never accepted, Sometimes we can do something about it, sometimes we can't. But this territory is 8,000 miles away, and the nearest territory we have is Ascension Island, which is 4,000 miles away, only halfway. So how we're going to do anything about this is almost impossible. It certainly seemed so at the time. However, the British government were quite incensed, and there was an emergency session of the House of Commons. Mrs Thatcher announced within 3 days, I think it was, the British were going to summon a task force, a naval task force, and we were going to sail all the way to the South Atlantic, which is the other side of the world pretty much, and we were going to try and retake the islands by force if necessary, and in the meantime try and negotiate with the United Nations and the Americans, and the French were involved as well, and trying to bring a peaceful settlement where the Argentinians would just withdraw and there wouldn't be any more shots fired. Well, to cut a long story, unfortunately the Argentinians refused to budge. Galtieri got his hands on the prize and didn't want to let go of it. Now there was, on the face of it, there was really little chance that we could do much about this. So the task force was sent, 2 aircraft carriers, HMS Hermes, which was what's known as the flag carrier, the Admiral, Sir Sandy Woodward. He was actually on this aircraft carrier, which had been converted to take the Sea Harriers, and we're going to talk about the Sea Harrier in great detail in a minute, but we'll come back to that in a second. The second aircraft carrier was the one that's actually depicted in the picture here on the front of the Kinetic kit, which is the HMS Invincible. Now, I have a tiny connection with this ship, and the HMS Sheffield, which was sunk by the Argentinians with their Super 8-ton Dart aircraft and their Exocet missiles, of which, by the way, they only had 5 apparently. They used them pretty effectively, although they actually fired 2 at the Sheffield and 1 missed. 1 hit it. But I'm jumping ahead slightly. So the Brits sail down. It takes 5 weeks, I think it is, to get down there. In the meantime, they decide to mount an air operation using the Vulcan bomber. Now, we've talked about this already in my Vulcan and Victor story, which I urge you to watch because it explains the very complicated logistics of how on earth you get aircraft such a great distance, and we had to convert the Victors into tankers to do it. So please go, I won't go on about that again, but please go and watch the Victor review that I did for the Airfix Victor and the Vulcan for the new Airfix Vulcan. Anyway, of course this operation was mounted, and as the task force are pretty much arriving in theatre, a 25-mile exclusion zone is announced by the British government that any ship that crosses the line to the Falklands, which is British, recognised internationally by the United Nations as British sovereign territory. Any ship that crosses this 25-mile exclusion line will be fired upon, potentially sunk. So two things happened. One is the General Belgrano, which is an ex-American battleship, strays across this line, and the Royal Navy have a submarine, nuclear submarine, which sinks it, with the loss of vast majority of the crew, certainly about half the crew. And this triggers a lot of condemnation because it's the first shot fired by the Royal Navy in response to the invasion of the islands. And a bit controversial, because obviously they didn't know the submarine was there, etc., etc., and they just got sunk. So a lot of lives were lost, so it's very unfortunate. Then, within a day or so, this Vulcan bomber raid arrives over Port Stanley in the middle of the night, and it bombs the runway successfully, but not for a very long term. It doesn't have long term effect, but it does in the short term. And it takes out a couple of their Pucara strike aircraft as well. So, anyway, then the war sort of gets into top gear. I'm not going to go into all the details of the war, but the key things that are pertinent to what I'm going to talk about today are obviously going to be the Sea Harrier operations from the two aircraft carriers. Or actually, the Invincible is what's known as a through-deck cruiser. Now, I said I had some involvement with this, not me personally, but my father again. People must. I know you watch this, think he's making this stuff up. I promise you, I'm not. About 4 years after he left BAC, he went to work for Vickers Shipbuilding Engineering Limited at Barrow-in-Furness, Britain's biggest shipbuilder, one of the biggest shipbuilders apart from those on the Clyde. And this company are based in Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria, which is the Lake District of the UK, southwest tip of it. Anyway, two things which I have this connection with via him is the fact that he worked on the Sheffield, just some final, he was a designer, and he did some final very late mods and things that they were doing just for it set to sea. And on the Invincible, they were just finishing the Invincible when he was working there. And there's two things that he said about it. He said that both these ships, especially the Invincible, were designed that if they were hit by a missile or gunfire, heavy artillery, they had very thin skins on the ship. And the idea was that any missile would actually, or shell, would pass right through. Obviously it might do some damage in between, but it would pass right through and not detonate. They were trying to stop detonation. And this was the theory that would save them if they were hit by X missile or a heavy, 15-inch shell or something. Now, those of you that know anything about the Falklands will probably know that the Sheffield, which was hit at the southern end of our exclusion zone, it was guarding the southern end, doing radar work, because the problem the British had, well, one of the many problems the British had, was that they had no airborne early warning radar like we have today. So all they had was the radar that was on the ships and the carriers, which only really reaches about 110 miles-ish. It's not a very big area, and you have to remember that frequently, there's a story I'll tell you in a minute about incoming aircraft. But if an aircraft is incoming and it's 100 miles away and it's a fast jet like an Aton Dad or a Mirage Dagger, it's 100 miles away. It's 10 minutes away. You've only got 10 minutes to react before it arrives and takes out your capital ships. So it's not much time, and that's not enough. You need 200 or 300 miles of early warning, and they weren't getting that. So a Super 8 on Dard launches 2 sets, hits the Sheffield. The second one misses, actually just fires off to port into the sea. But the one that hits it doesn't explode. Its rocket motor burns and continues burning in the structure of the ship and sets alight all the magnesium and aluminium parts, and it becomes an inferno. And this is what sunk the Sheffield. It didn't blow up like the Antelope did. The Antelope blew up, I think its magazine went up. So we lost the Antelope, we lost the Sheffield, we also lost, of course, the Atlantic Conveyor, which was carrying lots of equipment. It was a merchant ship that had been converted. And the Coventry was sunk as well. That was at the north end of the islands. So we lost 4 pretty important ships, and the Ardent, so it's the Ardent, Coventry, Antelope, Sheffield. 4 destroyers, let's call them destroyers. 4 Type 42 type destroyers, most of them were, gone. And this is a big loss, and the Ardent, you've probably seen pictures of the Ardent, actually broke its back and split into 2, like so, and then just sunk. just off Falklands Sound, and that was very, very sad, right in front of all the troops as well. So not good for morale. But anyway, getting back to the Invincible and the Harriers, which is what you're here for. Couple of books that you really should read about this, because I mean I could talk about this all day, but I'm not the biggest expert, and I'm still learning. I'm still trying to read these books to get through them. 2 books you mustn't miss if you're interested in this subject, because the important thing that I haven't told you yet is the odds. If any of you watch my Battle of Britain video, you'll know, and you may know from other books and things you've read as well, and films, the odds against Britain in the Battle of Britain during World War II against the Nazis and their Luftwaffe were enormous. It was almost 4-1 advantage to the Germans. Those are good odds compared to the Falklands War in terms of jet aircraft, fighter planes, military aircraft. We just had 21 Harriers. 21. They had, Argentina, 180 military, most of them were military jets, mixture of Skyhawks, Mirage, Dagger and Super 8 on Dart. Now they did only have 5 of the Exocets, and they ran out of them because they were embargoed as part of the negotiations with the UN and France and everybody else. Of course the AM-39 Exocet is made in France, so they weren't supplied with any more, but they did a lot of damage with the ones they had, and the Atlantic conveyor was sunk by another Exocet. So we were outnumbered 9-1. I mean, this is a staggering ratio. Staggering. And the most impressive thing of all, which is what we're going to talk about in a second, is the Sea Harriers didn't lose a single aircraft to air-to-air combat. A couple of them, there was actually one that crashed on takeoff. 2 crashed with a mid-air collision in bad weather, and I think 1, possibly 2, was shot down by handheld anti-aircraft missiles by the Argentine troops on the Falklands near Stanley. But not one was shot down by another Argentine aircraft, and they engaged each other quite a lot. So, if you want to know more about this subject, and I suspect you do, because it's the Falklands 40th anniversary coming up next spring, you need 1 of 2 books, or both if you're feeling flush. Now we talked about, in the Vulcan video, we talked about Roland White and his Vulcan 607, the Falklands mission, and how dramatic and daring that raid was. I'll talk more about that in a second, and I'll give you somebody else's opinion. He has written a book called Harrier 809. Now this is a brilliant book as well, and gives a very good overall perspective of the whole of the Falklands operations with the Sea Harrier. It's got some lovely pictures, and it's got some really good stuff inside. It's quite a big book as well. How many pages have we got here? We've got, yeah, there's 500 pages basically, just short of. We've got all the history of how they set sail, how they converted various ships, the development of the Sea Harrier itself, how the squadrons were formed, and then the mission, how they were going to get themselves down there, the practice, the training, famous pilots like Nigel Sharkey Ward, we'll talk about him more in a minute, and then there's the threat, you know, the Super 8 on darts, and just how the campaign was organised, or perhaps not so well organised in some cases. Again, we'll talk in a minute. But there's so much stuff in here. This is a really great account. All the major timeline events, you know, sinking of the Arctic conveyor, HMS Coventry being sunk, the Ardent going down, and then the return triumphantly after the Brits triumphed when they came back in, I think it was late June. A really good book, yeah. I mean, if you want to get a really good sort of snapshot of the plane and how it performed and what it was all about, to think that you're up against 180, 9 times the number of aircraft, and not to lose one against those planes is pretty unbelievable. This plane must be pound for pound the most successful military jet in history, you know, really. I mean, it took down, they scored I think 23 kills, including Pucaras, Daggers, Super 8 on darts. They shot down Hercules, which is quite controversial, I'll come to that in a second. Shot down a lot of RG aircraft, in the Skyhawks in particular. I mean, the great leveller, the thing that made the British have the edge, 2 things, I could argue 3, let's say 3. The pilots, beautifully trained, very, very skillful. Some questionable tactics, and we'll come to that in a second, but they had also the Harrier itself. And the great thing about this plane, of course, is it's got this thrust vectoring. And they have a thing called VIF, V-I-F-F, which is, it's actually a tactic of last resort, but it's called vectoring in forward flight, which means vectoring forward the nozzles to suddenly stop, effectively in the sky, hover, and let the plane that's chasing you overshoot. So you'd only do this if you're in trouble, real trouble, you know. And I think that the plan was not to get into that situation. And certainly, if you talk to Sharkey Ward, Nigel Sharkey Ward, the gentleman who wrote this book, who is the greatest exponent of the Sea Harrier, he talks about this and says, you know, you don't really want to get in situations where you're having to vector because it means that you've let them get behind you, etc. And they very rarely had to do it, and I think it was wasn't the chosen tactic of choice. But what was very important that gave us the final edge was the new American 9L Sidewinder air-to-air missile, heat-seeking, very effective, very good score rate, kill rate. And the Harrier only carried a couple of them on the outer pylon. Now they did add pylons to carry 4, I think. But very quickly at the beginning of the conflict, they only had 1 on each wing, so they only had 2 shots, really. They did have the Aiden cannons underneath, not depicted on the model we're going to talk about, but it is an option. But Sharkey Ward, I won't go into too many details here, because this is the book you need to watch. This is quite a controversial book, because he's very outspoken. He was a lieutenant commander, and he commanded 801 Naval Air Squadron, which was on HMS Invincible. Now, Invincible was the ship that was purpose-built for this conflict, if you like, or rather purpose-built for this type of conflict. The Hermes was an old-style British aircraft carrier where they converted it and just added the ski jump ramp so that it would be able to give short takeoff into the wind for the Harriers. Sharkey Ward, apart from being an ace pilot, he shot down a Hercules. I mentioned, I'll get this out of the way. Very controversial because, you know, some of the Argentinians felt that he was beyond sporting, you know, and he shot it down with guns, not rockets. And all the crew were lost, went to the sea just off Stanley. But that Hercules, as far as we knew, was carrying weapons, exocets, any number of things to help, you know, this illegal capturing and invasion of a British territory that is accepted as British territory. So may not be accepted by the Argentinians. I appreciate that, but the fact remains. So he shot this Hercules, and he shot down a Pucara, and he said that the pilot of the Pucara, and this is very important, especially for the Argentinians watching. Nigel Sharkey Ward was one of our finest pilots, and there's a number of them, Dave Morgan, and the list goes on actually. Obviously, not that many because we only had 21 planes, but I don't want to, by talking about him, I don't want to demean any of the people that might watch this and actually were there. So my hat goes off to you all. But he was a great proponent, and he's a bit of a renegade, a bit of a maverick, and he got into bits of trouble and a bit of conflict with the management of the Admiralty and the task force. We had Sandy Woodward, who was the admiral in charge. There were some questionable tactics employed. He was a great believer, a little bit like the Battle of Britain strategy. He wanted to have his combat air patrol, or CAP, flying around over the top of the fleet to defend them. This is what they do best. And he said this, we do this best. You've got the RAF had brought some of their Harrier GR3s along and were on Hermes. They could do the ground attack stuff in his view, but he didn't want his force of defence fighters, if you will, to be diluted. He didn't want that to be, you know, there was missions where they were sent off to bomb things, helicopters and things, and he felt this was foolish, because when they did this, it meant that they left the Invincible and the Hermes more vulnerable. And there was lots of cases that he documents in this book. It's very controversial, I warn you. He's not that enthusiastic about the Vulcan raid because he didn't achieve a lot, which I can kind of understand on one level. Huge effort to achieve just a stick of bombs, really. But of course, it did help, and it certainly boosted morale in the UK, and I think for the RAF and the Royal Navy, indeed, themselves. He wanted to let the RAF Harriers go and do the ground attack work, and he wanted to basically see off the Argentines, and he saw this as being the primary task of the Sea Harriers, on the Invincible especially. Now, there was a lot of problems because they kept getting instructions from the flag, HMS Hermes, the Admiral, And they had an Admiralty staff that were perhaps a little bit out of touch, and they weren't. Sandy Woodward said in his book, he's got a book out, I forget the title of it now, you could see it a few minutes ago, but I've forgotten, where he gives his account of the Falklands War, but he didn't really understand aviation in the sense that how to get the most out of it. He was really a sort of an admiral of the old school, probably quite a good admiral in terms of naval warfare. But he didn't appreciate that the Harrier was something very new and had wasn't the most high performance aircraft. You've got to bear in mind, a Mirage is twice as fast as a Harrier, Mach 2, you know? So the Harriers were subsonic, but they were manoeuvrable, and they were able to get in, get out, cause a lot of problems, knock out the Argentine aircraft and go toe-to-toe with them. And in a dogfight, there's only going to be one winner because the Harrier's got such great manoeuvrability. But anyway, but there were stories, and he was very upset about the Sheffield being sunk because there was several incidents where they were sent off to do sort of visual patrols, which is kind of a waste of resources. They were told not to use their radar, which was for stealth, if you like, but actually hampered them because they needed to get in close, so they needed radar far more than the Argentinians did in many ways. And he wasn't in favour of some of these tactics, and he thought it was foolish to go sort of hunting around the ocean 100 miles away in the wrong direction, looking for possible Argentine aircraft that may or may not be there. He wanted to strike them hard and in small groups and see them off, and he wanted to hit them before they damaged any of the fleet's ships. Sandy Woodward apparently didn't, in his book, he wanted to just, it was a bit like Trafford Lee Mallory in the Battle of Britain. He wanted to just knock out the Argentinians from behind as they were leaving, chase them west and take down as many planes as possible. Which is all well and good, but when you've got your ships being sunk, it's not a great strategy, is it, really? And these two, there's definitely a strong difference of opinion. After the war, they've both written books like this, and they strongly conflict with each other. He's a very controversial guy, Sharkey Ward. Now, let's have a look at the book. It's not the best book in terms of the photograph quality. By the way, I'm going to zoom you in. He's got a very impressive beard, and I almost look like I'm doing a Sharkey Ward tribute act at the moment, because I've got one too, but his is a bit better than mine, I think. It was. Let's have a look here. So we've got him crossing the equator, about to get a dunking, crossing the line ceremony. Then we've got him in the briefing room, and then we've got him taking off lots of shots of the Sea Harriers and their low-vis camo. Here's Sharkey. There he is. And he was, one of the most enthusiastic pilots, almost you could say, ambassador for the Sea Harrier. Really keen. And then he talks about all the things that went wrong and the Atlantic conveyor getting sunk. And each time he felt that there was not enough cover for these ships, and that particularly the other squadron, there was three squadrons. I think it's 800, 801, 809, and 809 were on the Hermes, and he felt that they were kind of not pulling their weight. Now he wasn't insulting the pilots. It was more to do with the instructions and the strategy that was coming from the command on Hermes, and they were being sent off to do all sorts of strange things that were not very, a bit counterproductive, wasting the Sea Harrier and treating it like it was just another Harrier. And of course, it's really designed as a fighter. There was also an incident which he mentions in the book here, where he was ordered to go off 85, 90 miles to the northeast, I think it was, to intercept 3 aircraft. And he refused, actually literally refused, and he said, no, you've got it wrong, these can't be Argentine aircraft, they're coming from the wrong direction, they can't be. And he insisted that he thought it was actually the patrol that had gone off from Hermes about 40 odd minutes before. It turns out he was right, and there was a big row on the RT between them, and ultimately they double checked and then realised that he was spot on. I mean, how embarrassing. So it's a good job we had this guy, maverick or not. Excuse me. He knew what he was doing, and he was very competent, and he questioned the competence of some of the senior management and some of the tactics, and some of these sinkings he thinks are quite regrettable, and most of them were avoidable. And he just doesn't feel that it was organised as well as it should have been. They had such a limited resource. It was vital not to waste them and not to go off, acting as if they got aircraft carrier with 70 or 80 planes, which they didn't have. 21 planes. It's scary. I urge you, if you like a bit of controversy as well, and you want to read some juicy stuff about how the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Navy were not really hitting it off, Invincible's, maverick Nigel Sharkey Ward at odds with the Admiralty and the flag who were in charge on the Hermes. Very interesting, juicy stuff, I've got to say. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on this, other than to say this plane was incredible. I mean, the Harrier was incredible, full stop. I rue the day, personally. I'm sure a lot of people feel the same way. I think it was a big mistake letting the Harrier be decommissioned as early as it was. 2011, I think it was. Don't see the point of that. It was a bit crazy. And now we've got this F-35, which is colossally expensive. Can't carry anymore, isn't reliable, and it requires a lot of maintenance. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Let us get into the model review. Bear in mind that the Falklands ultimately were retaken, and everybody I think agrees, including the Argentinians, that they couldn't have been retaken without the Sea Harrier. It made all the difference. It was such the right aircraft at the right time in the right place. But a quick word just about, before we finish on Sharkey Ward. He was very respectful of his enemy. Very respectful. I'm not sure if the Argentinians all appreciate this. He shot down this guy in the Pucara, and he said he was one of the bravest pilots he'd ever seen, a guy called Carlos Tomba. And he basically fought this, he came up behind him and he opened up with the cannons. He riddled, I think, the port engine, set it on fire, bullet holes all over the aircraft, carried on flying this thing. He wouldn't eject, he wouldn't, So then he riddled, Sharkey Ward attacked the other side of the aircraft and took out the right-hand starboard engine. And then basically as the aircraft, I think the left elevator, shot that off, and it was starting to fall out of the sky, literally. Only when that was the situation did the pilot finally eject at the very last minute, this guy called Carlos Tomba. And they actually met after the Falklands War and had the ultimate respect for each other. And he actually said that the Argentine Air Force were not well prepared and didn't have the right equipment, but the actual skill that they showed in the way they performed was absolutely fantastic and commanded respect. And they were respectful and concerned, they didn't take anything for granted. Not only were they heavily outnumbered by the Argentine Air Force, but they were using, these old Skyhawks. They used those Skyhawks very effectively. I mean, it was scary, you could see them attacking down Bluff Cove and places like that. And there were a lot of problems. I was reading that, I think it was HMS Ardent or Sheffield, maybe both of them, had problems with their anti-aircraft missiles. They had one or two technical issues which contributed to them being hit. I mean, the Ardent was bombed by a Skyhawk. I think one Skyhawk dropped 3 bombs on it, and then it ended up breaking its back and snapping in two. It was a scary, really brutal conflict, but the Argentinian Air Force particularly, they conducted themselves with great honour, and they were very professional, and they were good, they were scary good. So it's a good job we had Sharkey Ward and his colleagues like Dave Morgan and all these other men, because we only had those 20 planes. It's nothing. They had to use them carefully, but what a wonderful aircraft. So let's take a look at, this is what you really came here for, the Kinetic Sea Harrier FRS.1 in 1/48 scale. I'll move my books aside. I'll bring them back at the end perhaps. I'm just going to have a quick sip of coffee if you'll excuse me, because it's a long one, isn't it? Right, here we go. Now then, just arrived a couple of days ago. Nice, it's come all the way from the Far East, this one, so it's not a local delivery. Nice picture here, I'll bring you in. Lovely picture of the Harrier rising up above HMS Invincible in the background. My own involvement with this boat, Neil, but my father did work on some, they were actually doing some tweaking on the Sheffield, and the Invincible, he was involved in some of the design work for the final fitting up, and that was about late 72, early 73 I think. So it's bizarre, isn't it, that I've talked about a few things now, like the Vulcan and the Lancaster. I've got a few connections in the family, mostly with my dad, and the Lancaster was my mum. But yeah, he worked for a few companies. He worked for Ferranti as well, the electronics company who did Ferranti radar systems and things like that. In fact, when he was there, I mention this because I don't think I'm doing a review on this, he also worked on the Bloodhound, the RAF's ground-to-air defence missile. Something else he was. Anyway, let's get in close and have a proper look. Nice box, beautiful artwork, I've got to say, very nice artwork. Now remember that we had the 48 scale version of this from Tamiya, which was one of Tamiya's few real failures. Very bad kit with raised paddle lines, didn't go together properly, absolutely awful. I think this will be okay. What have we got? So, as we're looking at it, we've got Harrier FRS of Yeovilton, deployed to Hermes in 1981 to March 82. It's got the original scheme. Then we've got the HMS Invincible, so this is 801 again. Sorry, that's 800 the first one. 801, this is Sharkey Ward's guys, his squadron. And that was obviously for the Invincible. Now the Invincible, you know, the team on the Invincible were a dedicated sort of fighter team designed for combat air patrol to support those carriers and attack ground targets only as a secondary thing. Worth remembering that. Then we've got FRS of 899 Naval Air Squadron based at Yeovilton in March 82. Now, Operation Corporate, this is the operation code name for the retaking of the Falkland Islands. And here we've got 800 Naval Air Squadron based on Hermes. Then we've got 899 Naval Squadron Operation Corporate again, Hermes again. Then we've got the 809 Squadron on Hermes, 808 Squadron, and this is on Invincible here. And then we've got Exercise Arctic Express, and this is after the Falklands is over on HMS Hermes, but it stayed down there. Sea Harrier FRS 801 Naval Air Squadron on the Invincible, so this is Sharkey Ward's very own group, his team very much so. Zoom in for this a bit more. Quite hard to see, isn't it? So many of them, lots of options. And then we've got 899 at Yeovilton again in 88, I think that is, and then July 82 Yeovilton Air Show, and then there's an Indian option, Indian Naval Air Squadron 300 Squadron. Well, there you go. That's quite a great lot of super options. Let's get into it. Let's get into it proper. So, perhaps I'll zoom it the right way. Now then, I think we'll be okay with this. I think we've got resealable bags, but I'm probably going to build it anyway, so if it isn't, I think I'll get it. You've got to remember, this is such an epoch-making aircraft. I think I quite like to build a Harrier. So we'll just put that over there for a while. It's safe. Yes, the resealable bags are fine. Now remember, we have the Harrier GR3, so that some of these parts in the kit will be similar, some won't. And that was obviously at Christmas time. And we've got some photo etch. Now we also remember that Kinetic's instructions are not the best, and that's being polite about it, frankly. So let's have a look. Butchers. Oh, talking about British expressions, somebody very kindly helped me out the other week when I was saying about taking a butchers, and I said, I don't know where that expression originates from. Well, somebody put me right. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. He said it's a Cockney slang, Cockney rhyming slang, and it's a butchers is a butcher's hook or look. Let's take a butcher's. I know, very strange, but anyway, I'm sure he's right. At least for now we know. So, we're going to start off looking at the decals. Why not? And I'm very pleased to tell you that these are printed by Cartograph. So they're going to be absolutely super. Cross Delta Cartograph decals, they're going to be absolutely fantastic, I'm sure. Look at this. So, they are stunning. Quite glossy. As usual, they're very accurately printed, good registration, great colour, no excess carrier film, and all the markings are there for these many variants. Don't forget, there's a lot of variants. I'm surprised it's not a bigger sheet. In fact, what they've done here is basically provide you with all the numbers so you can make up your own options. So you can, if you want to do Sharkey Ward's aircraft, he was number 006. I don't know if it was 007. And you can just make up whichever one suits you, basically. And you've got all the variants down here, which is brilliant. Then you've got, of course, all your stencils. Harrier has quite a few, especially regarding all the nozzles and the jet pipes and the thrust exhausts and all that stuff. That's a beautiful sheet of decals, gotta say. Faultless. Love it. Good start, good start. Right, put that in there, it's safe. Now then, now remember what I said last time. I think most people that saw the review of the Academy Harrier GR1 and GR3 really enjoyed it, but everybody agreed that the instructions were absolutely dire, and I'm not sure these are going to be much better, although they are. It's kind of this black and white, like it feels like a photocopy, but it's not as badly photocopied, shall we say, as last time, because that was just awful. Yeah, these are a bit clearer and sharper and brighter, good contrast, which the other one didn't have. So let's bring you right in. So we've got the artwork on the front, the intro, tells you a little bit about it, talks about the Falklands, the AIM 9L Sidewinder, and it was able to achieve 21 kills without any air-to-air losses. Well, I've just checked, it's 23 kills, so that's slightly wrong, but close enough. Then we've got the usual sprue tree map, not very well done, I don't know why they had to print it so small. And then we get into the actual construction. So, let's have a look at this. Bring in a bit more. So we've got a nice cockpit stick, you've got your instruments, pedals going in. Have we got any... Yeah, okay, we've got a photo etch, but not for the pedals, which is fine because you don't see them anyway, do you really? Then you're building up your ejector seat, which I'm glad to say wasn't needed too often. Completed your Martin Baker jet pipe for the ejector seat at the back. Don't know how detailed it's going to be, but it looks okay at this range, so to speak. Then you're building up the back of the cockpit area behind that goes into the intake for your engine, and that is then affixed to the back of your cockpit that you've built up, seat area I should say. Pegasus engine, isn't it, in this? I'm just trying to remember what it was. Rolls-Royce Pegasus, or Bristol Pegasus. I think it was Rolls-Royce by this time then. And then you're building up your wheel well bay and your air brake, which is quite a big one on the Sea Harrier. I never quite understood why it needed such a big air brake. I'm sure there's an aerodynamic reason, because it's just that with the thrust vectoring I thought you could have used that instead. But perhaps it gave you more control at low speed to have an air brake and use your thrust vectoring for fine precision control. What do I know? I'm not flown on these things, that's for sure. So then you're building up a fairly usual thing where you're going to have your the system here for the nozzles, the sort of a little mechanism for the nozzles to operate them. That goes in along with all the other sections you've already created into the two halves of the fuselage. Then we've got these lovely looking blower doors, which you can have open or shut. It seems there's options here to have your blower doors open or shut for the intake blowers. Vents. Then you're building up your wing, looks fairly straightforward, and then you've got your nozzles going in, and from memory I bet these are going to be really nice, because the last time they looked like they were slide moulded and they were very, very beautifully figured, really good. And your heat shield blast plate behind there. A little bit of the rear of the canopy, the rear of the cockpit I should say, going in there. Then we have got the nose gear, the big, very sort of heavy duty nose leg on the Harrier, because it has to absorb all that bumping up and down. And then you've got your doors going in as well, and then you've got the rear wheel, because it is only a single central gear, double wheel, twin wheel on a single oleo. And then your doors going in, so it's all fairly straightforward stuff there. And then we get on to fuel tanks, optional fuel tanks. We've got Sidewinder, don't think that's right, obviously not for the Falklands, so ignore that. Don't take these as gospel, it depends on which version you're building. Probably for the Indian version, that. Then we've got, looks like Sea Eagle? Looks like Sea Eagle to me. Sea Eagle is actually a very similar type of missile to the Exocet. It's an anti-ship missile. Then you've got your all-important, for the Falklands campaign, your Sidewinder 9L. And in this case you've got the option of having it on a twin pylon, so you can have two on either side. Very important for Sharkey Ward, because I know he complained about this, saying I only had 2 shots, you know, until later when they developed these pylons. You've got your Matra 155 rocket launchers for ground attack, which they did use on the Sea Harrier. I suspect it looks like these are these ones that have got the protruding munitions, which is not really correct. That's how they appear when they're at air shows and things. I don't think they fly with that sort of drag when you're in operation. But anyway, cluster bomb, I think it's £500 cluster bomb underneath. And then you've got the option of all the different versions of these pylons, depending on which weaponry you're using. And then you've got your stores loadout there. So you've got Sea Eagles, you've got your Sparrow, Aiden guns, Aiden cannons here. Sorry, I skipped over them. They're appearing, sort of missed that. Building your 2 halves of your Aiden guns, 2 off. And that's what Sharkey Ward actually used, the Aiden guns, to shoot down the Hercules. A slightly controversial incident I mentioned. Then you've got your canopy going on. It looks quite nice, it's got a wiper built in. Of course, you've got this unique, slightly bigger nose on the Sea Harrier with the pitot head above it. And then you've got all sorts of aerials and intakes going on. And then you have got the options for your flaps. And they look really good, I've got to say. Flaps complete with the operating pivots that have got aero covers over them, bearings. And then we get into the many markings. So that's the Hermes one, the early sort of scheme, if you like. Then we've got the, oh, and here we go. What was I saying about photocopies? It seems to have chopped the tail off. That's bizarre. Yeah, it has. It's chopped the tail because it's chopped the top of the canopy off. Can you see that? Let's try to zoom in. Can you see how it's chopped off the top of the canopy? It's not my imagination. And then the tail's chopped off as well. You know. Kill marks for the aerial victory marks. Gosh. Then you've got your so this is 801 Squadron. This is the Invincible on the right. 006. Well, there you go. In fact, 006, the one that's next to my thumb, that is Sharkey Ward's plane, 006, which had 3 kills. Then we've got a little bit of data about what the pylons, how they should be painted, and which stencils go on which aircraft, which is really useful. Skyhawk kill marks, my goodness, showing off their prowess in the air, I guess. And then you've got the Hermes Operation Corporate, slightly different paint scheme, the lighter grey. And then we've got sort of more of the same really in the different versions. You've got the Invincible and the Yeovilton paint finishes. Again, I didn't know this when I opened it. Look, they've done it again. They've chopped off the image halfway. That's not very helpful, guys. That's not very helpful. What are they thinking of? That's a bit bizarre. They've really got to sort this out, Kinetic. It's the one thing you're making a total mess of it. You printed it well, but you only have printed half of it. That's helpful. And then you've got your Indian scheme. Whoops, I'll just come out a bit more. You've got your Indian scheme here. It's worth pointing out something which is... oh, they've done it again, look. Oh, come on. That's just stupid. Doesn't anybody have quality control in Kinetic? Look at that. You might as well not bother. It's stupid. Well, at least they've got the stencils in there. That's good. Nothing on the back. Should it be blank? Should it be blank? Oh, I don't know. It's got me wondering now, to be quite honest. I'm not sure I trust any of this. Anyway, sorry, I was just going to say that regarding the Indian Sea Harriers, that the Indians bought the Hermes after the British Royal Navy finished with it, and it's got quite a short name. I forget the name of it, but it's now, I think it's still operating today, and it's still got the Sea Harriers on it, and I think they had bought Sea Kings as well. They basically bought the whole setup from the Royal Navy, which is impressive because what it tells me, as I said earlier, we didn't need to decommission the Harrier then, did we? If it's good enough for the Indians, you know, they're still operating them. I have heard there've been 1 or 2 accidents, but you know, I'm sure that if they're maintained properly, I'm not saying they're not maintaining them correctly, but it's still a serviceable aircraft, so what did we get rid of it for? Anyway, I think it's probably politics again, you know, we don't really get into that. So, let's have a look at the plastic now. You're in for a treat, I think. I think we'll do a little bit of photo etch first. Here we go. Now then, we've got a little bit of flap detail, I think it is. There we go. How's that? Get it the right way up, it might help. Does it say Sea Harrier? Yes it does. Sea Harrier. So we've got some seat belts, which is good. And we've got several belts actually. A little bit of, I think, e-take detail. We've got some illumination bars. And we've got some, I think it's a leading edge flap reinforcement plate there. Whoops, sorry. Yeah, here, flap reinforcement plates. Yeah, nice, not much of it, but very pleasant. Very good. Now then, try not to have this green screen. I'm trying to get better at this, not leave you staring at nothing. Let's have a go. What have we got? Kinetics resealable bags are actually better than most people's because they don't. Some people are a bit like a one shot, and once you take it out, you can't get it back in again. Well, it looks brilliant. Look at this. Look at this. Oh, we're in for a treat today. Look at the detail on this. I'm just going to get some more light for you. If I can. Knock the coffee cup over. There we are. How's that? Look at the detail here. That's beautiful. Panel lines, rivets, access hatches. Oh, it's been really nicely done. That is a beautiful, beautiful Harrier. Oh yes. Here's your blast plate for the exhaust nozzles, jet nozzles. Here we've got the Sea Harrier's famous, very pointy looking nose. And then on the other side, whoops, the starboard side detail. I mean, that's just stellar. There's no flash. It looks absolutely fabulous. It really does. Not sure what to say. That's yeah. In my imagination, it's kind of telling me that's better than the GR3, but I don't know why that would be. I think there's a little bit of flash on that, not much, but just a little bit here and there perhaps. If it's not there, that's fabulous. Wow. Great start. Great start. Now then, next one. What did I say? Don't leave the screen green. Sorry. Right, let's go with these wings then. And I've also got something I need to talk about in here, which is about these master rocket pods that I alluded to in the instructions. Because there's a couple of problems with them, not just one as I mentioned. It's just occurred to me there's a second problem here. They look very sexy with their munitions pointing out, but that's not the way they would be on active service in the Falklands. They'd be all taped up and they'd be back in their slots, you know, much more subtly. And we've got what looks like, just like the GR3, I think this is coming off the sprue. It's quite a weak design of sprue here. It's coming away. It's separated in fact. Might just have to re-glue that. Now what I was going to say is about these 155 rocket pods, and by the way there is some flash, we just spotted it, look at that. That's not so good, is it? Here and here. That's quite nasty. There's a problem with these rocket pods because it's got them blanked off at the back. Well, that's not correct. That's not correct. I think sometimes they were blanked off with, I think they were like taped up somehow or shrink wrapped over the back for aerodynamic reasons. But most of the time you'd see them completely open, you know. And you see the jet pipe, the open holes, or what was effectively the exhaust for the jet pipe itself within. So they wouldn't look like that. Now you can get, I think it's a company called ResKit in the Czech Republic, or is it Ukraine? Ukraine. They do a very nice replacement for this. I know it's a bit frustrating, isn't it? Here we are with a new kit and we're talking about replacement parts and resin already. But that's not right, really. So, and I was actually reading that one of the magazines, maybe the FX magazine, they did a GR3 recently, and indeed they had replaced with this very same manufacturer's stuff, and they showed some photographs, which is where I learned about it from. So credit to FX magazine for that. But they're not really right, those. I'd be very tempted if I were you to maybe replace those. But everything else, apart from the fact it's rather weak on the sprue, looks absolutely fantastic. So let's put that away. We've also got the yeah, it's very familiar, very similar to the GR1 stroke GR3, isn't it, that we saw already. Let's pop that away if I can. So this is where it gets tricky every time. Once I've got it in there, it should come out easy next time, in theory. Right, sorted. Next. I like it. So far so good, apart from all the instructions. Just when I thought we'd sorted it as well, you know. Made a right mess of it. Alright, let's have a look. Yeah, I was saying about how good the bags were, now they look a bit more like a one-shot one again. In other words, when you open them, it's obvious you've opened them. Like it's on this on, look. Right, there's two sprues that are the same here, so we'll just focus on one. So we've got our missiles and stores basically. So, you can see here, this is the Sea Eagle I was referring to, which was not used in the Falklands campaign, but I think we did sell them onto the Indians, which is why it's in the kit. And a damn good missile too, very similar to Exocet, very similar in use and intention and performance, at least as good as Exocet. Then you've got these basically AIM 9 Sparrow, and then you've got your Sidewinder 9Ls, and this is the critical weapon for the Falklands that was really, really effective against these Skyhawks and these Dagger Mirages. There's no flash on this one, this is okay. Some nice pylons as well. Looks lovely. Yep, there's no ejector pins where there shouldn't be or anything like that. Looks really, really nice. So that's a double one, we'll put that back. Can't fault that. Very similar though. I think that may be one of the sprues that's in the sort of newer GR1, GR3 kit that they released around Christmas time. There we go. Right, now then, how about some clear parts? Quite critical because the Harrier's got this big canopy, and the Sea Harrier especially, where it's a raised cockpit, so the pilot can get increased visibility, and the intention being to give him the ability to look around and see what is what. Now you remember what I said on the GR1 and GR3, I think it's exactly the same here really, in that it's so good. Look at the det cord, detonation cord here. I think it looks like the like an arrow. Can you see that? There we go. The double arrows, detonation cord. Well, that is so nice. I don't know whether I'd bother painting it, you know. It's so well done. It's so pronounced. You might be better off just leaving it as it is. I'm very tempted, if I'm honest. And then there is a second canopy for some reason. It doesn't look quite as nicely formed. It's got some flash on it. Here. Now, what is that? Slightly different shape. It's not very nice, if I'm honest. That quality of this piece is really poor compared to the quality of this piece. So I'm not quite sure. I hope that this one is the British one. Maybe that's an Indian version, because I think most people will want the British version in terms of the numbers of people and how they'll use the kit. I know our friends in India will be. There's lots of them in India, and they'll want it to be good as well. But I'm not quite sure why there's double. But that may just be a generic sprue. It may be to cover both versions, but let's hope it's this one because that's lovely and clear. And frankly, if you look at this, there's quite a lot. If you make out a lot of distortion in it, it's not a good one. It isn't very nice, that. Not a good one. Distortion abounds there, whereas here there's pretty much no distortion. That's gorgeous by comparison. Anyway, a few lights and things apart from that, for the wingtips and stuff like that, but nothing much to glorious. Then we've got just a couple more bags, and we've got some alternative wing here. Now, quite sure which one is which, if I'm truthful. Without going back to the instruction, it should be too long, we won't do that. Oops, why they put it inside there, that's curious. Okay, so we've got alternative top wing. Almost feels like you can make a second Harrier out of this. That's a lot of wing there, isn't it? This is much better on the sprue, it's not as flimsy as the other one is. Yes, okay, again they've got a slightly strange cutout, the way that it doesn't create a gap here, which is the bit that goes into this corner here. There. I hope it slots in okay. I'm sure it'll be okay, I think. But the engraving and the way it's finished is absolutely stunning, isn't it? Look at this. Panel lining. Absolutely gorgeous. Stellar. Beautiful moulding there. Really nice from Kinetic. Well done, chaps. Yes, whoever designed this needs to design the instructions. Then we've got the tail planes here. And obviously you've got these blower intakes, air intakes for the Pegasus engine, and these optional various, whoops, careful, it's got the sprue that one. Yeah, they do seem to leave the sprue very easily. They've got these optional blower doors open or closed, and it's quite clever the way they've done it, because the ones at the bottom are open. It's all about centrifugal force, really, gravity I should say. So it shows in reality the top ones will be closed because gravity holds them shut, and then lower down they're open because they just flop open. And they've actually represented that here. Let me show you. I'm quite impressed with the way this has been done, because if you look carefully at the door, look how it's different. Closed at the top and then open at the bottom. Which is really good that they've gone to that length of attention to detail. We've got our Pegasus compressor blades here, and then on the other side, ejector seat and the cockpit tub. Back of the seat area. The seat does look a little bit on the basic side, but I don't think it's too bad. And then obviously you've got your this is your intake into the actual engine itself. All looks very nice, to be honest, very nice. That's really good. No complaints there. There we go, this is back in the bag, which is good. One more to go, and then we're done. And that's unfortunate, because I'm quite enjoying this actually. I'm enjoying love the subject. Falklands War was a very interesting confrontation, you know. In theory the British, despite the fact that we're kind of more experienced of warfare, but we shouldn't really have had a chance, you know. It just shows how good the equipment was and how good the training was. But, you know, it was quite a difficult conflict, a lot of people did die, so not something we want to repeat. So I hope we can put our differences behind us, Argentina and Britain, and resolve things more peacefully in the future. I think as long as that respect remains, I'm sure that's possible, and there's certainly plenty of respect on the British side, especially for the Argentine Air Force. You know, a very professional outfit they were. Now then, look at this. So we've got the later version nose there, which is not really intended in this FRS1. Again, there's a lot of sprues here where you've got multiple versions, so if you really want to, you could probably build several different types. Though I think that is maybe used on the Indian one, possibly. Then you've got your Aiden cannons here, Aiden gun packs that go underneath fuselage. That's your area for your air brake that we saw earlier. And then we've got our wheels and tyres here. There we are. Very nicely done. And we have got the jet nozzles. Now let's have a look at these jet nozzles, because last time we were mighty impressed with these, so let's get right in there. See if we can tell if they've been slide moulded. Well, I think it's obvious that they have been, isn't it? Look at that, how deep they look. Goes right in, doesn't it? right down. Yeah, that's very, very nicely done. And then on the front one, no, the back one, isn't it? The bigger one is the back one. Again, they've slide moulded it. You can look how deep they look. Very realistic. Those are lovely, aren't they? They've even got like a texture on them as well. Accurate texturing. Can you see that? My camera will focus. There we go. Probably a bit too close. Look at the texture of it. Wow, those are really, really nice. And then we've got some pylons for weapons here, including the cluster bomb pylon. And then last but not least, we have got final sprue. We've got a refueling probe. Well, that wasn't used on the Sea Harrier, I can tell you. But it's on the GR3, of course. It is on that. And again, there's a bit of a crossover going on here, isn't there, between the two kits? Three kits. You could argue the GR1, GR3 is two kits on this. There's your outrigger wheels. This is your mechanism for operating the nozzles, and that's the internal mechanism where the nozzle's attached to. And then, turn it this way, then we've got lots of the detail stuff. So you've got things like your control stick here, various intakes on the top here, fins, aero, trims and covers. There's the air brake itself underneath. You can see that? Yep. And then you got your main gear wheel, sorry, the oleo for the main gear wheel here. And that's the nose leg. And then you've got the internal structure underneath. This is for underneath the air brake. That's the internal side of it. And then you've got your flaps. I like the way they've done movable flaps. That's great. Or of course you can have just the pre-war version of the plane. It doesn't have the Aiden cannon, it just has these strakes. Very much like the American version, the AV8 has, of course, or did have. And then you've got it's a trim strake under here, a little fin. Well, what do we make of that then? I have to say that I had read, somewhere I'd read a review a while ago on this kit, and somebody said it was all covered in flash. Maybe they just had the mould a bit dirty and they've been cleaned up, because there is one or two bits of flash you'll have seen, especially on those rocket pods. I wouldn't discard those anyway. I don't think they're up to much, to be honest. I don't think... Whoops, come on, there we go. I don't think that's a big problem. I don't think flash is an issue in this kit, really. Certainly not a big problem, anyway. See if I can get that back in there. Go in. Yes. And we will have a verdict. Quite a long review, this. Long talk about the Falklands. I could have gone into the Falklands for hours, frankly. I'm not an expert at all, but there's bits I remember and bits I've read more detail about since. A very unusual conflict, and one that in theory Britain shouldn't have had a chance, really, considering our small task force that went down there, you know. And we lost several of those ships and a lot of men, very brave sailors and airmen, and soldiers in particular, especially on, you know, like Sir Galahad and Simon Weston and his guys that were bombed. Bluff Cove, terrible, you know, all burned and tragic, you know. But that's war, I guess, you know. That's what happens. But a very interesting conflict, a very unusual confrontation, you know. Argentina has, in theory, should have been able to knock us out quite easily, but they had limited, I guess, limited experience. I don't mean the pilots, I mean limited experience in terms of tactical and strategic. I think the strategy let them down, not the pilots at all. I think they were brilliant. They had great tactics. It was strategy that was bad. And of course, after the Vulcan bombing raid on Port Stanley, the Argentine government were very worried that the Vulcans were going to start bombing Buenos Aires and their airfields all over the mainland, because they were just frightened, you know. Just a point about fear and, you know, how difficult it is when you get into the unknown in a conflict like this. Basically, the Argentinians were terrified of this aircraft. and the Royal Navy were terrified of the Exocet, and that's a fair comment. I think that if you read any account you read, you'll see that's accurate. And they used to call the Sea Harrier the Muerto Negra, the Black Death, because they were just terrified of them. Every time they got into an engagement with the Sea Harrier, they got shot down. So I'm sure they wished they'd bought them, and of course they were offered these Harriers back in the 70s, late 70s, and they turned them down and went for French Mirage. And the Mirage was a good plane, and the daggers, and they were well flown by these guys, but it wasn't perhaps best suited to that type of a conflict where low level, over hillsides, the Harrier was kind of designed in the UK for that very terrain really, and that I think played into its biggest strength. Anyway, back to the model. Those instructions are stupid, a little bit improved in some areas, but then half of the artwork missing. Just stupid. Do some QC checks before you release the product. So it loses the point for that. However, putting that aside and a little bit of flash, I'm going to give it 9 out of 10 because I do like the kit. It's a great representation of beautiful artwork. The moulding is pretty much superb, apart from just the odd piece, those rockets, which, I just get rid of those, they're not right anyway. If you're doing the Sea Harrier based on the Hermes and the Invincible, they didn't often wear the rocket pods anyway. It would usually be these fuel tanks and sidewinders, so that's not going to be a problem anyway. So yes, as I say, 9 out of 10. I think it's a brilliant subject. I think they've executed it really well. Just sort your instructions out and just be a little bit more careful with your quality control. So there we have it. I hope you found it interesting. I would urge you, as I mentioned before I go, I'll just mention again, there's a couple of several really good videos on YouTube, nothing to do with me I'm afraid. Sharkey Ward, who is this controversial maverick genius lieutenant commander in the Falklands War, who had all these kills and got the Distinguished Flying Cross for his trouble. Distinguished Service Cross. How was this? Yeah, because it's not Air Force, DSC. But he has done, there's a number of interviews, it's actually one interview that's split up into 4 parts, and it's on the Imperial War Museum. They have it down there, I think it's at Yeovilton, but you can see it on YouTube, and it's a monologue. Don't miss this, because he talks about his book, he talks about the controversies, how he challenged Sandy Woodward about his tactics after the war as well as during it. And this one, this is a great overall picture of how the conflict unfolded, and even if you're in Argentina, I think you'll find this. You might find that a bit controversial if you're in Argentina. This one is a bit more sort of generically factual, like a historical document. You might enjoy this one more. Personally, I found them both absolutely fascinating. You're going to learn a lot of stuff. And it was very dangerous down there for everybody. The weather was terrible, the seas are horrible, the temperatures are low, and this was going into what was effectively November, British November. So it was going into the winter, start of the mid-late autumn when they went down there. A very tough conflict, very tough for all concerned, and let's hope there's no more conflicts like that in the future. And respect to all our friends in Argentina. As I say, we've put that all well behind us now, but it is a very interesting subject, and very, very fascinating to see that the mutual respect of the Argentinian forces and the British forces today, it is there. They're like brothers in arms. So respect to all of you, and God be with you. Anyway, enough of that. Enough of me. Hope you give us a thumbs up. Ding the notification bell if you haven't already. You must subscribe if you haven't, because you get more interesting videos like this. And it just remains for me to say thank you very much for joining me. Do take care of yourselves. And until next time, thanks a lot. Bye for now.